and the tax. So the challenge with testing and accountability is this: it's arbitrary and political.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me, Louis, do you have a question?
Yeah, so there were some questions in the chat that I think touch a little bit on what Dr. Vasquez Heilig is saying and what Linda Darling Hammond said too. So why don't we rely more on educator-generated assessments? And why are we using standardized tests at all if all they do is seem to drive competition, comparison, and that kind of top to bottom ranking that Linda was talking about?
Do you want me to take that, or
Sure, go ahead.
You or John
Sure.
or Brenda. And
Yeah.
so the same questioner kind of answered her own question a little bit.
Mhm.
It's another question, which was, well, given that the feds are still requiring school districts and states to do some sort of standardized testing, are there states that have actually found a way to make standardized testing a positive or useful thing rather than a punitive?
Right. Well, so the thing is, and Linda made this case, it's not that, and also Dr. Tanner made this case too. It's not that tests in themselves are problematic. It's how they're used, whether they're high stakes or low stakes, whether they're formative or summative. And so that's the key piece, is that we've been misusing tests for quite some time. So the test makers will say to policymakers, you should not use this test to evaluate teachers and decide whether they should be fired or not. They make it very clear, but policymakers go ahead and do that. And then a place like Houston gets sued and they go to court and the teachers win because these tests are invalid for those particular uses, right? So many folks have children and you want to know how your kids are doing generally. You want to know generally what percentile they are, but these tests have 30 or 40 questions, right? And so, if a child has a bad day and misses a couple of questions, it's a pretty dramatic impact on those scores because these tests are typically just 30, 40, 50, 60 questions. There's not many questions. And so we're making these very high stakes decisions. When I was in Houston, they had decided that they weren't going to do what they called at the time social promotion. And they were holding back all of these kids because they couldn't pass the test. Well, then the district found out how incredibly expensive that was to continue holding these kids back year after year. So, so it's not that we need better tests. I'm not going to say, Linda, one of the things she's really known for is, these different types of assessments, portfolios. There's all other, there's a whole set of assessments. Any researcher will tell you, the more data you have, the more secure you are in the finding that you have. And so a single test on a single day doesn't tell us a whole lot. So I think that's a key piece, is that we are using tests inappropriately for what they were designed for, and policymakers are just fine with that.
Yeah. John, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I'll even get to some specifics. Here are all the things you cannot use any state testing program for. You cannot use it to guide instruction at a detailed level. You cannot, and yet what do the feds require us to do? They require us to return scores. Why? So that teachers can use them to make decisions about kids. Completely unethical use of a standardized test score. You cannot look at a relatively high score and say that must be as a result of a good school, or a relatively low score and say that must be the result of a bad school. Really? You got to go look. You got to do your research. It could be that the high score comes from a school filled with kids who are going to score high in any school they attend in the state, in which case you're basically awarding a participation trophy. It may be that the kids who score relatively low are going to score relatively low in any school that they go to, and yet schools are keeping them in school, saving their lives and doing really amazing things. The misuses are so extraordinary with this methodology, and and it has to do, and the question about why do we use these? They're required by the feds. You could not satisfy the requirements under ESSA currently, certainly under NCLB, and certainly even under the 1992 or 94 law that Clinton passed. You could not satisfy the federal requirements without using a test that has what's called an underlying scale to it. It won't work. And there are a lot of reasons for it. They're highly technical. But until we can get a policy change, these really bad accountability systems, excuse me, this approach to testing is going to continue with these massive misuses that we see every day. And where that leaves us, I mean, imagine this, a test that was never designed to inform anybody about instruction goes into a classroom, and a teacher who is fearful for their job uses it to inform instruction. All of those decisions are invalid. That doesn't make education better for that child. It makes it worse. Where does that happen? More often than not, according to the equity conversation we're having, in schools where kids historically struggle. So basically what we're doing is looking at kids in schools that are filled with children who come from very challenging environments and say, we're going to encourage the teachers in that school to make really bad decisions for those kids. That is insane. And that the equity argument, and I thought that, Julian has hit the nail on the head. Testing has always been testing based on scaling, which is what we've had in this country for more than a century. And by the way, I usually chase it back to the 1850s on an event, but you got back to the Romans, which I'm impressed with. So I'm going to have to steal that from you. I thought that was great. But it's always been used to sort. And the equity argument seems to be that if we test everybody, that's equity. And I've never understood that, because the predictive or standardized testing has never contributed to the equity conversation in any kind of positive way that I've been able to identify.
And I'm going to put a link to an article that John wrote recently. John is a researcher and is deeply versed in test development as a developer himself. And it was really good article for those of us that are lay people on how questions are developed and how tests are developed, and what the underlying research says about that. But I want to turn to Brenda, and I know, Brenda, we've had several mentions of the Department of Ed here, and so I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable spot, but I know that we work with the Department of Ed on several projects, and I know that the Secretary of Education is pushing us, and it's like a ship where you've got tugboats that are trying to pull. I mean, it's a ship that's got a whole industry keeping it guided in one direction and habit. And we've had several decades of training and thought to go a certain direction. And I know you're trying to tug the ship in a little different direction towards some of the things Linda was talking about with innovative assessments. You talked about the letter that the Secretary issued this fall. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I do want to just sort of underline here that in the federal accountability system is designed to draw resources to students who are perhaps languishing, or subgroups of students who may not be meeting targets. And I think that's one important measure. Again, testing is a measure, including in the accountability system. It's not the end all be all. So it's very important to monitor progress, see how students are doing, to not be able to ignore the performance of English learners, for example, on year to year. Like that is crucial, and we should be drawing resources to students, particularly where they need it the most. But as I mentioned earlier, perhaps our assessment systems aren't meeting the mark, or there's better ways that we can start measuring higher order thinking, or consider multiple measures like performance-based assessments or portfolio-based assessments that can show us sort of a range of what students know in their own way, to demonstrate us, whether they're meeting, the state's college and career ready standards. I mentioned the Dear Colleague letter in November, where the Secretary is challenging states to improve their assessments, to rethink how they're, when these assessments are happening, and how learning is being measured. And this morning we did announce our new competitions, the competitive grants for state assessments, and we do have a priority in that competition this year on the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority. And I know that there was a question in there a little bit earlier whether we would be doing that in the competition this year, and we are. And that is a response to feedback that we received from stakeholders Spring of last year, we issued a request for information around the IADA specifically. The Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority is a flexibility in the law that's been in the books almost a decade now, that states really haven't taken us up on. Only 5 states are received that flexibility. Only 3 states remain in that flexibility, and it provides flexibility around double testing for states that do want to innovate their assessment systems. And we're seeing how that is playing out in particular states. So, for example, Louisiana is using through-year curriculum embedded assessments. I saw that there was a question here whether that would be permissible. Louisiana is actually piloting that right now in their particular state. Massachusetts is using technology enhanced science performance tasks for sort of bringing modernization to our assessments. And we're seeing sort of more interest in states wanting to employ more interim-based assessments so that information is getting to parents and stakeholders faster. So it is happening, and we at the U.S. Department of Education are supportive of that. We are not only, putting pen to paper here, encouraging states to do that, but we are also putting funding behind that. We are putting the competition out there for any state that wants to apply for the IADA. That is currently just a flexibility in the law. There is no funding associated to us. And we know that for states to change their assessment systems, it is very expensive to do. There's a lot of groundwork that has to happen in order for sort of a change of that measure. And so we're putting funding behind it this year. We are going to be issuing new grants for states that want to, for states that have an intent to apply for the IADA. And we hope that states take us up on that offer. And while we don't endorse any particular type of assessment or any curriculum, we really want to put it back on states to show us what that innovation looks like and how you are better measuring what students know and can do.
Thank you, Brenda. That was awesome. I encourage all of you to track the things that Brenda has brought up that the Department of Ed is doing, and go to their website and look for those, search for those things and continue to follow those. I know we've got people from different states other than Texas as well to be able to encourage use of those resources. So I just want to make a couple of comments just as I've listened to the conversation so far, and then Louis, see what we've got in the chat as well. I've got 2 children. One's a high school senior, one just graduated. Both of them are really, really solid students. Everybody wants to say their child is above average. It's the Lake Wobegon effect. But my kids truly, my son loves to read. He takes AP English, does well. He's going to do just fine. He's an artist. He has a lot of different interests. He loves school. He does terribly on state tests because he goes slow. He is methodical, and he's the kid who thinks too deeply about the question. So he's the one who will find 2 choices that are equally valid to a multiple choice question and labor over which one. He'll see beyond the test taker's intent or their more obvious intent, or he'll see the flaw in the question itself. And so he'll get halfway through his SAT. But he fortunately goes to a school where the high stakes don't matter. The school is going to be fine. So his school doesn't, they're not under the gun for every kid to make a good score. So they can afford to have some low scores. My daughter was the one who flew through the tests and would make an equally low score on standardized tests because she just wanted to get done with it and get on to real stuff. So, tests are made for the convenience of the test makers, the test administrators, of the system itself, and to use them in a high stakes way is a really dangerous thing that we've embarked on. And Julian, you just mentioned very simply the word politics and the other purposes behind it. And we've used something in a way that is very, very dangerous. And not just maybe not the best way to do things, but in a way that's very, very dangerous for for kids in schools. And it's why we're having this conversation today, because if we don't, I know in Texas, we have tried for years to tweak around the edges of the testing system to maybe get a little less to, and we've had some incredible folks. Raise Your Hand Texas did great work this past year, interviewed more than 100,000 people about testing around the state and conversations. It's great work. I would encourage you to go to Raise Your Hand Texas, their website, and take a look at what they've found last legislative session. But still, we're trying to work around the edges of the system. The conversation today is really kind of digging into the heart of the system, maybe the validity of the system itself as a way to improve education for kids. And as Brenda said, we've got to know how we're doing, but is this the best or only way? If this is, you know, really the only way, we're saying this is how we know on a 40 question test. So you know, this is the beginning of a conversation. We're having it in early March of this year in Texas. Our legislative session starts next January. And this is really the time to join Raise Your Hand Texas and other partners in having this question going into the session. Why are we continuing to do this when we're not seeing the results, the equity results that we need? So I'm gonna, Lewis, what questions do we have in the chat?
Well, so, you know, when Alan interviewed Linda, he and I were both working our way through her book, The Civil Rights Road to Deeper Learning. And, you know, Alan mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that when standardized testing, as we know it now for accountability, was introduced, there was lots of talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations, about low-income kids sort of being in the shadows and in the corners, and that testing was gonna disinfect and shine sunshine into the, you know, to the failed corners of public education. And, you know, that there are still crusaders who will tell you that standardized testing is part of a civil rights agenda. And, you know, Linda wrote this book and she listed 5 areas that she said were really the leading edge of civil rights in public education. And those areas were having a safe and healthy community, having well-resourced schools, having supportive, inclusive schools that include community schools, and then high quality teachers and high quality curriculum. So somebody in the chat was asking, where is curriculum? And what impact does high stakes testing have on the kind of curriculum that kids, and especially very needy kids, end up getting exposed to?
So let me, if I can, let me chime in on a couple of those because I think it's important. So one of the things that is fascinating to me about the way we treat testing is that one of the legitimate uses of scaling methodologies is to be able to detect the amount of a trait that people happen to possess in society. And it's kind of remarkable that we can do that because you can't actually measure how much literacy a person has. That's impossible. What you can do is you can analyze what the sum of literacy looks like across population and analyze the patterns in that. And that's a really powerful thing to do. And we see in the patterns when we analyze literacy that there's a direct correlation to socioeconomics. Well, that ought to be a signal that we go fix socioeconomics. You know, that's a good signal that we have a problem in society and we should go do it. And instead, this over-reliance, this weird reliance on standardized testing says, well, the problem must be in schools. And I mean, the complete breakdown in logic in that is extraordinary. But let me go back to something that was said earlier, because I think this is important. And I think this is a great conversation to have. But we're all focused on testing right now. And what I want to point out to it is, and I agree with, we need better tests. The testing environment in America is weirdly behind the rest of the world in terms of innovation and doing interesting things. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But we have a much bigger problem in accountability in this country, and that is that we remain the only profession, the only institution that we can identify that still uses compliance or thinks that compliance can substitute for effectiveness. And that is the most illogical thing that we do. We say, we draw a line in the sand and we say, everybody above it, compliance, you're fine. Everybody below it, you're not. We might as well say you complied with FERPA last year. Congratulations, you were a great school. And there's just no logic in compliance ever being able to substitute for accountability. In fact, the business people we work with, people all over the world we work with, have told us that our organizations would completely fail if we were forced into a compliance-based accountability. And so we need to fix the testing piece. We have an impoverished testing environment in this country, but it wouldn't matter if we have the most perfect test in the world, the most beautiful test that did absolutely everything we want a test to do. If we stick it into a compliance formula, we just lost. We just corrupted the very intent. Campbell's law, very famous law. When we try to use a social decision-making tool, or this kind of a tool to make social decisions, we corrupt both the thing we're observing and the observing tool. And that will happen every single time. So I argue as loudly as I can, yes, let's fix the testing piece. But until we can, in our minds, move outside of that compliance-based approach to accountability, these conversations are useful but academic. We aren't going to solve the bigger problem until we figure out how to get past the fact that we remain completely anomalous in having picked compliance as our accountability model. And we didn't pick it. Let's be clear. Not one person on this call picked that model. That model was picked before us. It was picked before any of us got into education. So it's not something new, but it is something that we absolutely have to deal with.
Can I just kneecap one of those arguments, not from Dr. Tanner, but about the soft bigotry of low expectations. I posted a link in the chat. One of the things I've been very fortunate to do in the last decade was serve as education chair for the California NAACP when I was at Cal State on faculty. And then when I went to Kentucky, I was asked to serve in the same role for the Kentucky NAACP. And so I've really had a front row seat to the evolution of this conversation in the civil rights movement. I think one thing to know is that after Nation at Risk, when these tests started to come into full view in states, Florida brought forward the FCAT, and the NAACP sued the state of Florida in Deborah P. v. Turlington. And so the NAACP was at the forefront of criticizing these exams for a variety of reasons. And I invite you to check out that case. I won't go into all the things that were argued in that particular case. Well, then you saw the billionaire foundations in the 2000s, early 2010s, really funding a lot of money into various civil rights organizations. And then you saw this coalition of folks come together and say, oh, well, tests are about civil rights. Sometimes you hear that same argument for choice. But in the years following that initial coalition, the NAACP came out with a very strong statement from the Washington Bureau about the role that these tests had played in problematic education for African American students. Now, I posted that link in the blog here with that Washington Bureau release. And so I think it's very clear that the civil rights movement does not agree with maybe what some right-wing politicians say about the soft bigotry of low expectations. I'm just going to be as frank as I can with you about that. I think the civil rights movement, especially the NAACP, has come to a place where they understand the role that tests have taken in stratifying African American communities and so the deleterious effects that they've had on Black students.
You know, I've got a question for our experts here. And I was a teacher for many years, and I hear lots of times that you know, I think the most common thing is we need to have all third graders reading on a third grade level, and if we don't, there's all sorts of bad things happen and all. But I know the test itself that's used in Texas is the STAR test. It goes by many names, and you know, around the country, but that the goalposts change all the time. And the test, something actually, Julian, I learned from you
Yeah.
probably 2008 or 9 when we first met,
Yeah.
was as a teacher, I didn't know that the test was not standard from year to year,
Right.
that it was apples to oranges, even from 2008 to 9 to 10.
Yeah.
So when we say a child is reading or not reading on a third grade level,
Yeah.
based on a STAR test rather than kind of a standard, the assessments
Yeah.
that used to be in school, what's going on?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me say something on this, and I bet you Dr. Tanner probably wants to say something too. But let me tell it as a story. So I was working in the Houston School District right in the middle of the 2000 election season. And I was responsible in Houston for putting together the testing reports each year and basically figuring out what our gaps or gains had been, and then sending that up with memos to Paige and the assistant superintendent. That was one of my responsibilities as in the research department, accountability department. And I remember in the year 2000 that oh, we experienced, and don't quote me exactly on the gains, but in my mind there was like 3 to 4 point gains in every group, in every grade. And I thought to myself, this is really unusual that you see these huge gains in a particular year, because it wasn't anything really that the district had done. Like, we didn't have any large scale initiative or made in these huge investments to see these huge gains take place in the district. Well, my office mate, in a sort of sardonic way, said, "You do realize it's an election year, don't you?" And I thought to myself, no, no, they couldn't, no, they wouldn't do that. Well, 3 years later, the Houston Chronicle did a investigation, and they found that the TEA had decided that that particular year that the test was more difficult. Now, I'm doing quotation marks, was more difficult. So they had changed the cut scores and the requirements to pass different sections. So I'm just going to make up some numbers here. Let's say you needed to pass 10 questions. There was 10 questions in the math section. If you passed 7 of them, you were passing, because of course, in a criterion-based test, it's simply whether you pass or didn't pass. In a norm reference test, you're compared in a percentile way to other people. So they're different. These are different tests. And so then that year they said, well, you only need to pass 5 instead of 7. Again, I'm making these numbers up, but that's essentially. And so at the end of one of my comments about 5 or 6 minutes ago, I said that accountability is political and arbitrary. It's because with the state test, the TEA can manipulate how those results look, because they tell the test maker what they want the cut scores and the essentially the reports to look like. Let me give you one more story. So I was responsible for the accountability and test report for the district, because at the same time that there was a Texas district, a Texas report, Houston was releasing its own accountability report, and we were giving grades to schools. And I remember I was responsible for setting the limits on the grades. And this was like the 3 little bears. Okay. What do I mean by that? So I set the limits, like out of my head, out of thin air. I decided what was going to be an A school, a B school, high performing, low performing. I just made it up. And so I sent it to the superintendent, and Rod Page sent it back and said, that's too many low performing schools. So out of thin air, I decided what a new level for low performing. And that went back to the superintendent, and that was too few low performing schools. Have you ever thought about how low performing is defined, or why it's defined that way? Or why Houston School District was taken over because they missed by 1 point, some arbitrarily decided level? So these things are related. And so essentially, I sent back a 3rd try, and that porridge was just right. And so that's the thing about these tests and these accountability levels and ratings. Somebody somewhere like me is sitting in an office and out of thin air deciding what low performing actually is or what high performing is, etc. This is all a true story.
Well, isn't that in part the basis of the lawsuit now that school districts have brought against TEA? That the education agency started to signal to districts that they were going to move the goalposts. They were going to change the cut scores. They were going to make high school, the accountability piece for high school. They were going to jigger different elements of it, the result of which was going to be fewer schools meeting the criteria.
Exactly. So to add to arbitrary, in Texas, it's arbitrary, political, and punishing.
And underfunded.
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna take money as inflation happens. You're actually gonna receive fewer dollars. And Brenda, I just want to say, I know there are states we look at longingly that are trying to be progressive, that are trying to do the right thing, and so there is hope, and we appreciate. I think the attitude of the Department of Ed in encouraging where they can in our federal system. But John, do you want to dig into what Julian has said, or Brenda?
Yeah, well, your question was a good one. Because we know through research. I'll be careful. I'm not a reading researcher, but we know that if kids don't have some basic amount of literacy by some moment in based on age, that that disadvantage is likely to continue with them for a long time. And so it's incredibly important that we have information as to the degree of literacy that children possess and so on and so forth. These are incredibly important things to do. We can study literacy in a population using a standardized test, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand the level of literacy a student possesses, an individual child possesses, from one of these instruments. When Binet was building these things 130 years ago now with no computers, which I find just remarkable. When Binet was building these things, he was very clear in stating just how massive the error in these things was. And he wasn't saying, hey, I created a really awful test filled with error to make specific decisions. He said, I'm trying to understand something that is impossible to actually measure. And so a really flawed instrument can be useful, but I'm going to have to make sure that I never make a single decision about a child until I have lots of information from lots of different sources and can express with some confidence a statement or a conclusion about that child. And so that's the test makers in the 20s, Stanford was the first, said, we're going to invent this thing called grade level equivalence. And boy, we've just obsessed over that ever since. My child is at a 5.3 and they're in third grade. So my child's obviously gifted and genius and so on. And we've just kind of sucked ourselves into that thinking. And so when we take a standardized test at third grade in Texas, and we draw a line in the sand and say why that student must be literate, the question that I would have is, okay, but go read my paper. I can talk about how is it you analyze something you can't measure, and that's what we do. How can you say that a student possesses a sufficient amount of literacy to be called literate off of an instrument that isn't designed to measure how much literacy any child possesses? It's impossible. It's not that we shouldn't use it. There are wonderful uses for these instruments. We can do all kinds of analyses with these that can contribute greatly to the problem. And we should take those instruments and those results from any number of diagnostics and so on, and we should put them into the hands of a thoughtful educator who is capable and trained to make decisions about literacy. And we should entrust that decision to that person. What we should not do is draw a line in the sand on that test, say, well, above it you're literate and below it you're not. I mean, we'll be wrong so often in that decision that it becomes an invalid way to assess. So being able to be literate by a certain age is an absolutely critical thing to do. Testing can help contribute to understanding, but if we don't put the decision into the hands of a thoughtful educator or researcher, we're going to miss the boat on most kids. And that's my concern with the question you asked, is that testing can help. But what we've done is in Texas is we draw a line in the sand and say, that's it. And that's just, it's misclassifying so many students that it's doing, in my opinion, more harm than good.
So John, if I could just add to that, my personal experience again with one of my children that is what was my son as a senior is a beautiful writer. I read his writing. I'm an English teacher, a writing teacher. I think he writes like he's a high level undergraduate, and it's just beautiful, thoughtful. He reads a lot, and so he's imbibed just the sounds of good writing, and it just comes out, and and he enjoys it. He was always a grade level behind coming through elementary school on all his ELA kind of measures, spelling, and I mean, all those kind of things. He was always, it just took him time to, he was just still working on second grade and third grade, it just took him time, but he's emerged into this, but the system would brand him as one of those kids that is behind. But I do want to, Brenda, I do want to say one thing. I mean, an irony we have in Texas, and you're absolutely right in we need ways to make sure we're not overlooking English language learners, for instance. But the irony in a state where testing has been so much at the forefront of the approach is that Texas has spent many decades in court dealing with underserving English language learners, and constantly delaying and delaying and delaying, pushing off lawsuits one after the other. IDRA in San Antonio has, dedicated, it's their mission to, to continue to hold the state's feet to the fire for English language learners in the courts and with research. But it has been a constant theme that the state has underfunded and under-resourced, our work with English language learners. But the irony is that we have a lot of numbers, but we don't have always the decisions, the actions to back those up. But Brenda, would you like to comment on?
I'm going to sound a little bit like a bureaucrat here, in the sense that like the department doesn't endorse any sorts of specific types of assessments or curriculum. I'll separate that. When it comes to English learners, however, there is a requirement in federal law that they be annually assessed. And English learners, as you know, is a protected category in terms of the overlap in education between civil rights law and federal K-12 law. And that intersection is quite interesting when it comes to English learner and the use of assessments for English learners, because they're not just used for accountability systems, which we're discussing here today, but for English learners, it's particularly important because that is what's used to make placement decisions in terms of where English learners are placed in terms of their English language proficiency. And I think one of the benefits of this particular of ESSA is that it is holding high expectations for all English learners, such that your English learner proficiency standards have to be aligned with your academic content standards. So, we talked about having different expectations for students. What a way to sort of say that English learners, their level of curriculum and the expectations around what they know and can do should be the same as all students, right? We shouldn't expect to have English learners sort of be in a segregated area here. You're only doing intensive EL services, and then we're going to focus on content standards. I think there's an expectation that is happening at the same time, and that at the U.S. Department of Education, one of Secretary Cardona's raised the bar priorities is on multilingualism, is on embracing the fact that students are not only English learners, but they're dual language learners, right? There's so many benefits for cognitive development for dual language learners or multilingual learners that can speak, more than two or more languages, and that has significant benefits to students. But I do think that the assessment conversations around ELs it's particularly distinct because not only are these assessments, or the EOP assessments, are used to make decisions on placement, but they're also used to make decisions on exit, and when students have then reached proficiency and then are no longer considered ELs. And that data for ELs, or former English learners, is really, I think, speaks to the benefits of knowing more than one language. You can check out our EL performance data at eddataexpress.gov. There we have all the data on our Title III programs, and you will see that our former English learners, so those students who were previously identified as English learners, went through an EL program and then were reclassified as ELs, are actually outperforming their never EL counterparts in some very critical measures like math and science. So I think there's a ton of benefit in terms of embracing language. And I think when it comes to embracing culturally and linguistically diverse assessments, there's more that we could be doing for the content assessments as well.
So Brenda, we had a wonderful visit with Secretary Cardona about a year ago. In fact, a year ago this week at Webb Middle School, and he sat for about an hour and a half with a group of parents. And this is a school that has a wonderful English language development academy for newcomers. It's had it for several decades, does great work. About 70% of the students are English language learners at the school. And it is also a community school. And I think when we talked about equity, and Linda was talking about this, many of these families, I mean, we can do all sorts of learning and assessment. As she mentioned, you can measure the cow, weigh the cow, but not feed the cow. And, you know, the cow's not going to do well. You know, these students, many of them come from family situations where they need extra supports. They're just fitting into the community. There's financial issues, there's all sorts of other issues, and they need those supports. And they do really well when they've got this community of support around them. And when they've got smaller, and the school is intentional about smaller class sizes. Budget cuts at the state level have made that more and more difficult to keep those class sizes in place. But as an equity conversation, it really is all for English language learners. I think the community school approach and that very holistic approach especially applies to them. And I'm very thankful that the Department of Ed has greatly increased its funding for community schools and its focus on community schools. And certainly our conversation a year ago blended that with multilingualism in that conversation with the secretary. And it was very, very, very exciting. We're just about out of time, and I just want to give everybody maybe a final comment. And I do encourage, we put some great resources. This is the beginning of a conversation, as I said, leading into, for Texas, our legislative session. Thank goodness we only meet every 2 years. But it's, you know, we can be thinking about really, you know, do we stop nibbling around the edges and start getting to the heart of the matter? But I'd like to give Julian a final word, and John and Brenda final word.
Yeah, I'll try to go quick here because I have a 2:30. I'm actually in DC to testify tomorrow in charter school, so I recommend you check it out of the House Ed Committee. You can watch online at 10:15 tomorrow. But on this topic, I think it's important that we not get backed into a corner that student outcomes equals test scores. And that state departments of education, and no disrespect to the U.S. Department of Education, make those decisions for us. That these should be community-driven processes, strategic in the long term and in the short term. We invented an idea called community-based accountability. That became law because there's someone in the chat that keeps asking about where should we look? California is one of those places. They have the LCAP where communities come together and define the student outcomes that they care about. So when under No Child Left Behind, we were stuck with AYP and graduation rates and dropout rates, and that was decided by some bureaucrat in some office somewhere. But what the community-based accountability does is it allows us to prioritize the things that matters in our community, whether it be reducing suspensions, formative, summative portfolios, whatever those things are. Communities come together and they make those strategic decisions together. It's in the same vein as community schools. There's a whole set of public policy that is community-based and community-driven. That's an alternative to the top-down approaches that we saw with education reform for the last 2 decades. So for every approach that is top-down and about private management, there's a community-engaged, community-based educational policy approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. John?
I'm going to echo that, and I'm going to say that, point out that I started the community-based accountability movement in Texas. We call it benefits-based accountability now that we've taken it national. It works, it's great, and it's exactly what Julian described. It's asking about the hopes and dreams of a community and accounting for those things in a way that makes sense to that community, with the result being, and Julian's comments said it throughout, the creation of a trusting relationship between a community and its schools. Without that trusting relationship, our public schooling system isn't going to be in serious trouble going forward. And as Julian said, it works. That's the most amazing thing to me about this stuff is it works. I'll encourage all of you to rethink accountability. I'll encourage everyone to continue to support the department in terms of coming up with better ways to test. That's never a bad thing. But let's fix the accountability piece first and get rid of this compliance-based approach, because until we do, like I said, and I'm a broken record, we're not going to get to the places we all need public education to be.
Thank you.
And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brenda?
Thanks for the conversation, Alan. I do want to reiterate here, and I feel like I sound like a broken record, that the end goal here is to draw resources and not to neglect where, you know, there have been historically, I think, persistent gaps in how certain subgroups of students are doing. And I think that the goal here is to draw more resources to these students. The Biden-Harris administration has been a strong supporter of full service community schools. And, you know, I think we need to think of a whole systems approach, right? It's not just one silver bullet or one simple solution that's going to address some of these challenges. I think when it comes to assessment, we're really putting it back on states. We are funding this work. We want to see high quality assessments that really show what students can do in innovative approaches. So we're excited to see where that goes. Again, we just announced this competition today, so we'll be following up with more on the actual the dollars, and we hope that they do take us up on this and are encouraged to rethink the way that the sort of measurement of learning is happening, so that we can draw resources to students in a more efficient and faster way.
All right, I want to thank our panel today, and we will be sending out, if you registered for this webinar, if not, please put your email address in the chat, but we'll be sending out a link to the video for this so you can show others, link to the materials, and we'll continue this conversation. But again, thank you to our panel, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. And thank you to everybody that's participated. We'll talk again soon. Thanks.